Hi, this is Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and in this video lesson, we're going to learn how to configure mobility options in Windows 8. This lesson maps to Objective 5.2 of the Microsoft 70-687 certification exam. That's configuring Windows 8. This objective has 5 sub-objectives. The first is configure offline file policies. Offline files are this really cool way to keep a copy of files that are normally located on a server, even if you're offline. So just copies a file to your local computer and then syncs it up for you automatically. We're also going to learn how to configure power policies. Power policies define how fast your computer runs and how fast it burns through those batteries. So you can tweak those policies to get some more life out of your batteries at the cost of some performance. The next sub-objective is configure Windows to Go. And Windows to Go is a technology where you basically install Windows on a flash drive and then you can boot up any PC from that flash drive. And it's like you have your own custom image of Windows using any piece of hardware. It's great. And it's been covered in another lesson already, so I'm not going to duplicate that here. The next sub-objective is to configure sync options. These are the settings that are automatically synchronized on your PC. Things like the personalization features of Windows 8 that can be synchronized with your Windows Live account. And the last sub-objective, configure Wi-Fi Direct. Now, that doesn't really exist yet, and I don't think it should be part of the exam objectives, but I am going to tell you about Wi-Fi Direct so you'll know what it is if you ever see it. So let's start off with a real-world scenario. You are planning to travel where you're not going to have internet access. That means you won't be able to use a VPN to get to your internal network. You also don't want to have to manually copy files from the file servers to your local computer and then remember to sync them back up. Well, this is exactly what offline files are designed for. We're going to configure a shared folder to work offline so that we'll be able to access that shared folder even when we're not connected to the network. Here's my Windows 8 start screen, and I'll jump to the desktop and open up File Explorer. And we can see that I have a shared folder here. It's my Z drive, and there's a file in it, important stuff. And indeed, it declares that it is important. So I have a network connection to the server, and as long as I'm connected to the network, it's no problem. But what happens when I disconnect from the network? Well, let's simulate that. Oh, we can see that this icon just changed to a little warning. I don't have any internet access, so I'll try to open the file up again. And, well, of course it's not going to work. I don't have an internet connection. So I'll reconnect to the network and we'll see if we can configure it for offline use so that the next time we go offline, we'll still be able to edit the local copy of it. All right, there you go. We can once again reconnect. So I'm going to go back to the start screen, and first you need to enable offline files. So I'm going to turn on offline files by searching for the settings for the phrase offline, and then the manage offline files tool comes up. This is pretty straightforward. There's a big button that says enable offline files. That's what we want. And that's all there is to it. Now you'll need to configure the individual folders for offline files. But before I do, I'll peek over here at Sync Center. We can come back to this later and it will show us what the active state of any file synchronization is. Now we're going to need to get that file when we're offline. So, and know it's located on my Z drive here across the network on a server. I'm going to right click that and then I just select Always Available Offline. And that's all there is to it. You can see the icon here pops into the task manager and it shows that the synchronization is completed. You can always open up Sync Center again to see if the synchronization is still occurring or if everything's been copied down, but there was just one file, so it pretty much happened instantly. So what I'll do now is I will disconnect this computer from the network and we'll see if we can still access it. So keep your eye on that network icon in the lower right corner. Just went red. That's not good. So we must be offline now. Maybe I'm on the subway trying to get some work done. So once again, I'll go from my computer here and then go right into the Z drive. And look, this time it actually let me browse it. Let's see if I can open it up. Yes, I can. But you can see here, I'm definitely not connected to the internet. So what I'll do is I'll make an update to that file and we'll make sure that it gets synchronized okay. So now my subway ride is over. I can connect my laptop back up to the network and synchronize the settings back to the server. Let's go through that process. All right, well, I can see that this once again provides me network access. I'll open up Sync Center. And we can see that as soon as I connected, it started syncing up. But what's this? One conflicts. So I click that and it tells me that there was a conflict with this change. Now, a conflict can occur because I'm editing it when I'm disconnected from the network. So anybody else could be connected to the same file and editing it as well. That's the challenge with offline files, is you don't take the file with you. You're not physically moving it. You're creating a copy of it and then you're syncing it back up. And if you're the only person working on the files, the synchronization will work all the time perfectly. However, if there's other people who might be editing the files at the same time as you, well, you have two different copies, and Windows isn't smart enough to sync your changes back up. So what happens is Windows will detect that a change was made on the server and a change was made to an offline copy and just tell you about it in the Sync Center here. So it's important to be aware of this and to be able to resolve it. All you need to do is to follow this exact process. Now, it's showing me the file that was modified and it's telling me exactly what happened to it. I'll double click it now and we can see a little bit more information. You can see it's allowing me to choose which version I want to keep. The version on this computer, the local copy, keep the version on the server, the remote copy, or to keep both versions by renaming one of them. So here, so we can see both copies, I'll keep both versions. Now, this is what you want to do pretty much all the time, because if I were to pick this, I'd be overwriting whatever changes somebody else made to the copy on the server without knowing what they did. And you don't want to throw away other people's work unless you feel like infuriating them. So let's keep both versions and we can go back to the shared folder. And now we see two copies of the same file. So some mystery person made a change to the server copy and now I can open it up and view it. So this is the server copy and you can see they made an important change while we were offline. And here's the copy that we edited while we were offline. They both exist. Because this type of conflict happens, you know, I'd have to figure out some way as a human to resolve this. So what I could do is I could copy that in and switch over to my copy, and there, now we have all the information in one file, and I would just need to delete the original file here and rename it. So basically you end up manually merging the changes. Now, some file types, like Office file types, have tools to automatically merge conflicts, but really nothing works well enough that you can rely on it automatically. You pretty much always have to look at the files and merge them together. Some database software can be a little bit smarter, but yeah, it's pretty much on you to fix it. So now I'm going to demonstrate how to configure offline file policies by using group policy settings. This allows you to fine-tune how offline files work, either for all the computers in your Active Directory domain, or if you were to use local group policy on a Windows 8 computer just for a single computer. This is my Windows Server 2012 domain controller, and you can see I'm editing the default domain policy in the Group Policy Management editor. The offline file policies are located under both user configuration and computer configuration, depending on whether you want to apply it to groups of users or groups of computers. We'll look under Policies, and then Administrative Templates, Network, and finally Offline Files. Now, there are a large number of policies here, and I'm not going to walk through every one of them, but there are some that are particularly important to be aware of. There are two policies here that relate to slow link mode. Slow link mode is a useful way of using offline files when a connection is technically online, but not working that well. So imagine that you're working at home from your remote cabin in the woods and your only internet connection is a satellite link. Now, These satellite links can have a latency of a full second because the connection has to go from your satellite dish in your cabin up to a satellite that's orbiting the Earth, that's far away, and then all the way back down to another satellite link. And every single packet needs to make a trip from your cabin to space, to the corporate office, and then back to space, and then back to your cabin. So you see these really high latencies and really slow connections. If it gets to be too annoying, if it takes you too long to save your files, well, you might want to go into offline mode so that you're working with a cached copy of it. And then when you're done, you could just sync it up. That allows you to save locally and do all your stuff locally, and still takes advantage of the kind of conflict resolution that we have built into offline files. So you can use these policies to fine-tune when slow link mode comes in. Now, the configure slow link mode policy allows you to first enable automatic use of slow link mode and to fine-tune it for the particular number of milliseconds or throughput that is available for a given connection. So what you'll do is you'll enable the policy, and then you'll click the show button here, and you'll need to type in name value pairs. The name is always going to be the share name. You can specify it like server share in standard UNC format, and then apply a wildcard somewhere in it. So if you wanted it to apply to all files within a given share, you'll add that asterisk there, which means anything. You could also use it differently. You could use this format to apply to all shares from a server named server. Now we're going to specify either the latency or throughput, and you don't need to memorize this because the examples show it really well for you here. But if you wanted to have this come into effect anytime your latency was over half a second, you would write latency equals 500. 500 milliseconds is half a second. And that would mean that it would kick in automatically for a typical satellite connection, which would have a latency of greater than that. And you can repeat that process for every share or different combinations of shares, file types, and bandwidths. This is the configure slow link speed policy. When your computer detects that it's connected to what it considers to be a slow link, it'll start to use offline files a little more efficiently. It's not going to try to sync everything as frequently as it otherwise would. You can enable this policy and then set a default configuration. Now, this you don't typically need to enable, but I want you to be aware that the slow link speed setting exists and that you can configure it through group policy. We see some policies here related to the reminder balloons. These reminder balloons are important, and they pop up and warn you of things like conflicts, and they'll notify you when a synchronization is taking place. Unfortunately, offline files does work automatically, but it also requires you to kind of be engaged. So users have to be aware of what's going on, and they even require some training so they know how to handle conflicts and such. So it's almost more of a power user tool than a tool for the average user. Well, if you find these reminder balloons annoying, either because they disappear too quickly or they stay up too long, you can adjust these policies to fine-tune their behavior and how often they pop up. If you decide that you do not want users to use offline files, you'll want to enable this policy. And here's the reason you might do that. Offline files are convenient, but as with everything in security, the convenience comes at additional security risk. So imagine that your users enable offline files for a shared folder that has a ton of confidential documents in it. Those confidential documents now get automatically copied to their computer. And what if they're at the airport and they lose their computer? What if somebody steals their computer? What if they get some malware on their computer that copies all their files off to some internet server and gives them away to the public? Well, that means your confidential files go with every different computer. So a lot of organizations are going to want to turn off offline files. If you decide to leave offline files turned on, you need to be sure that you're not worried about any content on a file server being copied to any computer in your organization. It's going to leave your network. Now, there are a couple of things you can do to reduce the risk of it. One is to encrypt the offline files cache. You can simply enable this here, and that takes a little bit more work. It means that the offline files are going to be encrypted on the disk, and the processor has to do some cryptography to make them that way, and then whenever they access them, they have to be decrypted. But the performance hit is not much at all, certainly not for the benefit. So I think this is a really worthwhile option. Now, the challenge here is encryption's only meaningful if the user doesn't leave their computer logged on. So if you take advantage of any type of encryption, whether it's offline files encryption or BitLocker or EFS, be sure to configure computers to automatically lock and to require a password when they're coming back from a sleep state or a resume state. So what you don't want is somebody to close their laptop and go through security, and if they get their laptop stolen, somebody can just open it up and continue the session without typing a password. Users should always have to type a password if they step away from their desk or if they close and reopen a laptop lid. That's the only way to prevent somebody from just resuming the user's session without typing a password, thus bypassing all encryption. Here's another useful policy. Enable file synchronization on costed networks. Now you can see this is a policy specifically introduced for Windows 8. Now Windows 8 has this concept of metered networks, and these are for mobile broadband networks where you have to pay for every bit of data that you use. That's in contrast to, say, a wired network or a Wi-Fi network where traditionally you can use all you want and you don't have to worry about it. If you are on a metered network, what they're calling a costed network here, same thing, enabling this policy will allow file synchronization to happen over these metered networks. You can see that by default, or if you've disabled this policy, offline file synchronization won't happen across metered networks. So basically you won't be able to automatically sync if you're connected across mobile broadband, even if you establish a VPN connection back to the server. And here are 3 settings that initiate synchronization at really important times. So this one, synchronize offline files before suspend. Suspend is basically sleep mode on your computer, and it's common practice for users when they're leaving work to just shut their lid on their computer, which will cause it to go ahead and suspend. If you enable this policy, which is a smart thing to do, you get the option to perform either a full or quick synchronization before the suspend starts. So their computer won't immediately go into suspend when they close their lid, but it'll fire up Sync Center and download any files for offline use before shutting down. So usually that sync, especially if you just do a quick sync, will only take a couple of seconds, and it might slow them down, but on the other hand, it can also make sure they have the latest copies of the files that they need. So use this if offline files is important to your organization. Otherwise, leave it disabled just to save your users the trouble of waiting for the synchronization. You can also see here 2 policies that initiate synchronization before logging off and when logging on. Only you know how the people in your organization might use offline files, but if you find that their workflow has them logging on and off regularly and you want to make sure things get synced up when they do, go ahead and enable those policies. Here's another policy, and this one is particularly useful for security purposes. Enable file screens. It can also be used to reduce bandwidth, but when you enable file screens, you can specify the types of files based on their file extension that are excluded from offline file use. So imagine that you want to make sure none of your spreadsheets, which maybe they have payroll information, they aren't synchronized. If your spreadsheets always have an XLS or XLSX extension, you can enable this enable file screens policy and then type those extensions here using the same wildcard that you use in other places. They have an example for you here, but the asterisk replaces any part of the file name, and if you need to list more than one entry, you separate them with a semicolon. Just so you know, XLS and XLSX are the file extensions used by Microsoft Excel spreadsheet app. So those aren't all the policies, but I think those are the most important ones. So here's another real-world mobility scenario, and this is something I personally do all the time because I travel. Now, if I'm getting on a flight and it's a 6-hour flight and I'm going to try to work the whole flight, well, I have one of these little Ultrabooks, a Dell XPS 13, and its battery is rated right about 6 hours, but frankly, it usually lasts more like 4 to 5 hours. So I want to get as much work done as possible, which means I'm going to tweak the settings to get as much battery life as I can. Windows gives you a lot of power over the compromise between performance and power usage. So let's set up a computer to be as efficient as possible so we can squeeze as much battery life out of it as we can. So this is my Windows 8 laptop, and I find the easiest way to edit the power settings is just to go to the desktop and then find the power button here. Now I can click more power options. Now there are a number of things you can do to get more battery life out of your PC, but the top two things are really easy. First, put your computer into airplane mode, and you can do that from PC settings, wireless, and then just clicking airplane mode up here. That turns off all your radios and such. Most mobile computers also have a hardware button. Sometimes you have to hold down the FN key and press F2, but that will actually physically turn off the radios, and those radios use a lot of power. So I'll go back to the desktop here and show you the other one, which is to adjust the screen brightness down. Now, you won't see this here on the screen as I'm capturing it, but the LCD panel I can see is getting dimmer and dimmer. And that LCD panel uses a whole lot of power. And you know what? When you get on the airplane, it's usually pretty dim in there relatively. So turn off that overhead light if you have it, turn that screen brightness all the way down, and you'll get a lot more battery life out of your PC. Now on the power options control panel here, which hasn't changed a bit from earlier versions of Windows, you'll see the default power plans. You have to have administrative access to change this, so I'll elevate my privileges by clicking that link. And now you can see I can choose from 3 different plans. By default, my computer is configured with the standard default, which is balanced. Balanced tunes a whole bunch of little minute settings to achieve a good compromise between high performance and long battery life. The high performance option here tweaks those settings so that your computer is faster and brighter and you have more wireless range. It does everything a little bit better except conserve battery power. If you choose high performance over balanced or power saver, your battery will burn faster and you'll be out of power sooner. So here's the thing, if I'm on a 2-hour flight and I have my 5-hour battery, well, I put on high performance. That way I'm getting the most out of my PC possible and I'm not worried about running out of battery. If I'm on a 6-hour flight and I need every bit of energy possible, I switch over to the power saver here. So a lot of settings change, but as I switch between them, note the screen brightness slider here, how it changes. On power saver, it's down a little bit. When I go up to high performance, it's all the way up. And when I go to balanced, well, it went down because I had adjusted it down manually. So I'll look at the different settings that we can fine-tune by clicking Change Plan Settings here. Now, again, this requires administrative access, so I'll have to click this link. You can see the most basic settings here and that it has separate settings for when you're on battery and plugged in. You can see from this icon here that I'm currently plugged in. So on the balanced plan, by default, it dims the display when you haven't used it for a minute. When you're plugged in, it waits 5 minutes. This example is really typical of how it works. There'll be some more conservative setting for when you're on battery power and some more aggressive setting when you're plugged in. The display turns off after 2 minutes on battery power and off after 10 minutes when you're plugged in, and the computer goes to sleep after 5 minutes when you're on battery power and never when you're plugged in. Frankly, you can save yourself a little electricity by putting your computer to sleep after 5 or 10 minutes. And the only reason you wouldn't want to do this is if you're, say, downloading a big file that takes hours, or if you keep open a chat connection and you want to make sure that your computer stays online. You can also see the difference in the automatic brightness when you're plugged in or on battery power. These are a second level of settings, but there is a third level that's even more advanced. So I'm clicking that Change Advanced Power Settings link down here to open up the Power Options dialog. And once again, I'll have to click the Change Settings link to elevate my privileges so that I can change anything. This top link here allows you to choose which of your current plans you're going to be editing. And here you can see a great deal more really minute settings, and You generally don't ever have to change these. You can see it's got little settings like whether you require a password on wake up. As I was describing earlier, if you feel the need to protect your computer with encryption, if you have anything confidential on your computer, yeah, you better require a password on wake up. This setting controls how long until the hard disk turns off. Now, in my experience, the hard disk never really turns off. There's always some app that's using the hard disk every few seconds, much less every 10 minutes. So I don't find that that setting impacts the power usage at all. There are some settings for the Internet Explorer, the JavaScript timer frequency. That's little client apps that run within a web page. And if you're playing a game in JavaScript or something, this might make a difference. But for the most part, that's not going to have a huge impact on your power usage. The desktop background settings, well, I don't even think Windows 8 has this, but I haven't seen it if it does. Anyway, earlier versions of Windows used to show a slideshow on the desktop, and you can see that by default it pauses it when you're on battery. Now, this is something that I find really useful. And in fact, this isn't the default setting because this is my personal laptop and I've changed it. But the wireless adapter settings, when you're on battery, it by default puts you at medium or low power saving. And what that does is it reduces the power of your Wi-Fi card. So that might work okay for you, but it reduces the range and performance. And I found that as soon as I went on battery power, I couldn't even connect to my wireless access point anymore. I didn't have enough power. So what I had to do was I had to change this to maximum performance. And once I went on maximum performance, I was able to connect to my wireless access point, whether or not I was on battery. Now, try it out. If where you are, you're able to connect and get to the internet just fine with, say, maximum power saving, that's great. It'll save you power. But if you're finding that you have a really weak signal, well, you can go in and adjust this and set it to maximum performance and at least get yourself connected. Yeah, you'll be using more battery, but if you can't get your work done, what's the point, right? So these sleep settings control when your computer goes to sleep or goes into hibernate mode. So you can just fine-tune those to whatever you want them to be. The USB selective suspend, this will automatically turn off USB devices that are connected to your computer but not in use. And I don't know any reason to turn that off. Some older USB devices might not play well with selective suspend. So if you're having a compatibility problem, I guess you could go in and try that. But for the most part, you should be fine. Now, this is an interesting item. Some drivers, such as my Intel graphics driver here, can add custom settings to this and allow you to fine-tune how they use power. So you can see that my graphics card, which is just built into the motherboard, happens to add its own custom settings. So you might not see this, but I can choose between extending the battery life when I'm on battery power or getting more performance out of it. I actually don't need a lot of graphics power because I'm not playing games, so I'll set that to maximize the battery life. Here you can control what the power buttons and the lid on a clamshell style laptop will do for you. So you can control whether the power button and the sleep button, if you have separate things, what they do. But most people, when they push the power button, they just want it to go to sleep. And when you close the lid, you want it to go to sleep too. Sleep in Windows 8 resumes in just a couple of seconds, so I don't find it inconvenient at all. Now, there's no reason to change this from the default, but the PCI Express is just the communications channel that your computer's motherboard uses to communicate to your network adapter and your video adapter and other accessories like that. So you can control the power management on it, but generally the default settings are going to be just fine there. Now, this is another important setting, and that's the processor power management. Now, back in the old days when I was a kid, a processor, well, they ran pretty slow. Let's say they ran at 15 megahertz. That wasn't a bad speed at the time. They ran at that speed all the time. It was flat out 15 megahertz. It was like if you were a runner and you just had to pick one pace to run all the time, you just kept up that pace. Nowadays, all computers, both desktop and mobile computers, have processors that can adjust their speed. When there's a heavy load, when you're doing something intensive on the computer, they'll be running flat out, like sprinting. And in fact, you'll often hear the fans on the computer spin up because when it's running fast, it's generating lots of heat, and therefore it needs to turn on these fans to help cool it down. So your computer's processor in all modern computers will go between running fast and slow, cool and hot. And when it's running fast, it's going to be using more batteries, of course. Now, you can specify the minimum and maximum processor state using these settings. And by default, you don't even need to change it because the minimum processor state just means the processor will always be running at least 5%, and that's fine. That's practically off. The maximum processor state, you could choose to limit this when you're on battery. I don't know that it would actually save you any power though, because if you ran it at half speed, well, it would have to run for twice as long, right? It still has to get the same amount of work done. So I say leave these at their default settings, but know that you can go in there and tweak them if you want to. The system cooling policy, what will happen here is the active setting is a little more aggressive when it turns the fans on after it detects some heat, and passive means that it's going to try to cool itself off by maybe running that processor a little slower. It will kick on the fan only if things get really hot. But generally, passive cooling means it's going to slow things down a little bit until the processor isn't so hot anymore. Active processing means the processor is going to keep working at full speed, but it's going to spin some fans to try to cool it down. Here you can see you can control how the display is dimmed and turned off depending on whether you're connected to the battery or not. The multimedia settings allow you to keep the computer running if you're sharing media. So, something that's kind of cool to do is you can hook up your stereo to read your audio and video files from your computer. Then you can listen to your music from your stereo or hook it up to your TV and watch all the videos. Well, that's what this is talking about when you're sharing media and when you're playing video. Now, if you're streaming video or audio from your computer and it's on battery, you probably don't want the computer to go to sleep. So you'd want to turn this off and probably set it to prevent idling to sleep to keep the computer online. That's the default for when it's plugged in. When playing video here, you can choose to optimize the video quality or optimize the power savings or pick a setting that's in between. This is going to be useful if you're like me and you tend to watch movies on your computer in the airplane. I'm not always working, right? So you can see that I have it set to optimize power savings. What that means is when it's playing a video and it has to choose between doing some extra processing on the video to make the video a little nicer to view, or skipping that and showing me video that's a little less sharp, it's going to err on the side of power savings. If I was taking a 2-hour flight and I had plenty of battery power, I might change this to optimize the video quality. Finally, the battery settings down here define how the computer responds when the battery power levels change. So the reserve battery power level, well, this basically tells your computer to lie to you about how much power you have. It's kind of like if you have a car and you drive it until that needle goes down to E, but it doesn't seem like you run out of gas as soon as it hits the empty marker, right? Cars always have a little bit of reserve gas in there. The car lies to you about how much gas is in it, and it does it because it knows you think you can make it to the next gas station even when you can't. So the car kind of saves you that way. And the computer does this too. It keeps a little bit of reserve battery power in there and allows you to go a little bit longer than you might think. It also means that once you think you're out of battery, you'll still be able to fire it up for just a couple more minutes off of this reserve. So you can also control whether the computer bugs you about hitting the low battery level. That's the low battery notification. And what the computer does when it gets to the low battery state. You can have it do nothing, where it just tells you, please shut down, or you can have it automatically go to sleep. I prefer just to be warned, and then I can save my work. So after you've done all that, you usually want to click Save Changes to apply them. Now, I'll show you this other setting here. You can see I have this link for Dell Extended Battery Life options. I'm using Dell computer, and they have implemented some custom things, and it's specific to Dell. Now, if you don't have a Dell, you won't see this, but you might see something different because different computer manufacturers will provide custom tools optimized for their particular hardware platform. So there's nothing here that's going to be on the exam, but just for real life, be aware that you might have some Samsung or Sony or Dell tools in there that will allow you to get a little more battery life than you would otherwise. Keep an eye out for them. One more thing to show you here, and that's this create a power plan link. Now, by default, you get the balanced, you get the high performance, and the power saver, and I just showed you how you can fine tune those. Well, if you want to make your own custom plan, you can do that. So maybe you want to have an airplane mode. And then you can go in and customize these to be whatever it is you want. And as you can see, I now have an extra airplane mode here. Now I'm going to give you a brief tour of the group policy settings related to power. So let's jump over to our Windows Server 2012 computer. You can see I already have the group policy management editor open. So I'm going to expand policies and then go into administrative templates, system, and then power management. And in here we'll see basically the same settings that we've been fine-tuning. You can see select an active power plan here. Allows you to specify the power plan that any computers that the group policy applied to would have. For example, if you just want all computers in your organization to go to the power saver mode, maybe because you're trying to cut back on your electric bill, you could enable this policy and then select power saver. You can also see that these settings, which map directly to the settings I just showed you, allow you to configure how the different power buttons and lid operation affect the computer's behavior. These map to the hard disk settings. These are the different battery notification settings. Here are settings that allow you to tune the different sleep states. Now, the Windows 8 defaults are just fine. Earlier versions of Windows had these separate states for sleep and suspend and hibernation, and nowadays sleep pretty much just takes care of it. So for Windows 8 computers, you really don't have to worry about this too much. They have this one state that basically puts your computer to sleep, where it's still running but not using much power, and then if you don't use it for a while, it goes into hibernation mode automatically. The difference is that Hibernate stores a copy of the computer's memory to the disk, allowing it to be shut off completely without consuming any power. But before you can use it again, well, it has to read the contents of the memory from the disk. Sleep keeps the memory active so that when you resume, it pops back up basically right away. In Windows 8, when you close the lid by default, it saves the contents of the memory to the disk, just like it does for hibernation, but then it stays sleeping. It stays on a little bit. That way, if suddenly you lose power, no problem. All the memory is stored on the disk. If 5 seconds later you open the lid back up, it can pop up right away, just as if it was waking up from a sleep state. And this last setting down here just allows you to fine-tune the video and display settings, things like the brightness. I also want to show you that you can configure the preferences under user configuration here and preferences. So you won't see preferences when you edit group policy in Windows 8. You have to be on a server computer to do this. We'll go under control panel settings and then power options. Here you can right click and create a new power option. You can see that they have different settings for XP and Windows 7 and later. Really hasn't changed since Windows 7. This allows you to create an entirely new setting or update an existing one. So let's say you want to update the balanced plan. You could select this to set it as the active plan, and then maybe you want to change the low battery action so that it always automatically goes to sleep, whether it's plugged in or not. This, because it's located under the preferences here, it defines the default setting for computers, but users can go in and change it later. Now, the difference between this preference and the policy is that policies will, by default, override settings that the users make. So policies force things on users, and preferences just define defaults. Now, a lot of mobile users hop between different computers. You might have a desktop computer that you use when you're doing your day-to-day work at your desk. Then you have a laptop computer that you use when you're out and about, or maybe you're just in your living room and you don't feel like sitting at your desk anymore. This is exactly how I work. And synchronization makes my life much easier because it syncs my settings between my computers. So let's open up Windows 8 and take a look at the different sync options we have. From the Windows 8 Start screen, I'm going to open up the Charms bar, select Settings, and then select Change PC Settings. Down here, I'll select the Sync Your Settings page. And this gives you access to all of your different synchronization options. The first option here controls globally whether settings are synced, and by default you can see settings are synced. I should mention you need to log in with a Windows Live ID to sync your settings, and then any future computers that you sync those settings to will be automatically synchronized for whatever it is you specify here. Now, let's say, for example, you want to have your desktop computer be blue and your laptop computer be orange. You would turn off the personalization synchronization. You can do this on a computer by computer basis. So if you want all your computers to be blue except your laptop to be orange, well, leave personalization on for every computer except your laptop. You can see there's a separate item here for the desktop personalization. This refers to all the Windows 7 style settings. Now, Windows 8 has a feature where it will sync your passwords for you. This is really useful. It allows a new computer that you log into to automatically connect to your home group, to automatically connect to your networks, and this can be a real time saver. However, it doesn't do it by default. You know why? Because you might be logging into your friend's PC and you don't want your passwords on your friend's computer, right? I know I have friends that I don't trust that well. So if I were logging in, I wouldn't care if it copied my desktop background down, but I wouldn't necessarily want my website passwords on there. You know what I mean? So I would not trust my friend's PC, but I would trust all my own PCs. And the remaining settings just control whether different aspects of the computer's configuration are synced. Ease of access provides accessibility tools that help people with vision or hearing or tactile problems. Language preferences, of course, things like whether you speak English or Spanish or if you prefer alternative input methods. App settings are settings that are specific to apps and they are synchronized by default. Your browser settings like your history and favorites, of course, that only applies to IE, which nobody uses, so who cares? I'll say that I use Chrome, and Chrome provides its own synchronization, and it works great. I have to log in separately into my Google account, but I prefer that over Internet Explorer synchronization. And finally, things like your File Explorer and mouse settings can be synchronized or not. Now, the last options here configure whether or not you synchronize settings over metered connections. And once again, metered connections are these broadband connections where you typically have to pay for every byte. And if it's kind of expensive, well, you're going to want to go in and turn off synchronization over metered connections. And you can see here you have the option to sync unmetered connections even when you're roaming. And if you ever travel into a foreign country, you know that roaming data is way more expensive than regular data. So Windows has this kind of separate level where if it knows that you're roaming, it won't sync over your metered connection. But if you're just a daredevil and you're super rich and you don't care about that, I guess you can choose to sync up over your roaming connections, but good luck to you. So finally, let's talk about Wi-Fi Direct. Wi-Fi Direct has absolutely no business being on this exam, in my opinion. Wi-Fi Direct is this very cool protocol that allows you to transfer files from smartphone to your PC using Wi-Fi, which is like 802.11g, 802.11n. Right now, we can transfer these files most easily through Bluetooth. Bluetooth has been around the longest, but Bluetooth is really, really slow. Like, Bluetooth is fine if you want to copy over some contact information, like your email and phone number. No problem if it's, 20, 30 bytes. But you wouldn't want to be sending a movie across Bluetooth. It simply wouldn't be fast enough. So Wi-Fi Direct steps up the bandwidth a little bit. It can use your computer's existing wireless card to transfer between any two devices. Wi-Fi Direct is this emerging standard. It's not really implemented yet, but it's coming out, and I'm confident in 5 years we'll all be using Wi-Fi Direct to stream files from our cell phones to our laptops. Maybe not, but it's an open standard, so it's entirely possible that it's going to emerge and become important. Wi-Fi Direct does not require an access point. So, of course, you could stream between two wireless clients if you were at home and everybody was connected to the access point. But if you're in an airport and you want to copy a file from your smartphone to your PC, right now there's not a great way to do that, at least not if it's a big file. Wi-Fi Direct connects them without that wireless access point in the middle, but it uses the full bandwidth of wireless. And in fact, when connecting two wireless clients across a wireless access point, you're actually limited to about half the available bandwidth because each of the clients will consume half the bandwidth going to the wireless access point, if that makes sense. Because Wi-Fi Direct transfers files directly between two clients without requiring them to send it to and from a wireless access point, you actually get about twice the bandwidth and twice the throughput. Wi-Fi Direct is always encrypted, so it's always secure and you don't have to worry about people sniffing your traffic. Wi-Fi Direct, as I was saying, it's mostly for peer-to-peer file transfers and for streaming. The big advantage of it is, well, it does the same thing as Bluetooth, it's just faster. And it's accessed by adding a device in Windows 8. So you can go to the devices page of PC settings, and if your computer has Wi-Fi Direct and there's another available Wi-Fi Direct device, a smartphone or a digital media receiver or something, you'll be able to just click it. You don't even need to know that Wi-Fi Direct exists. Right now, the current state of Wi-Fi Direct is that Windows 8 has some APIs built in. API is an application programming interface. And basically, it's a little tool that an app could use, but it doesn't provide a user interface. So there's nothing right now you can do to take advantage of Wi-Fi Direct. You have to wait for some app developer to release a Wi-Fi Direct tool. Maybe there's something in the store now, but I couldn't find anything. And Windows doesn't have anything built in. So the exam objective tells you to learn to configure Wi-Fi Direct, but there's no configuration settings, and in fact, I couldn't find a single app that takes advantage of Wi-Fi Direct. All I could find are people on the internet saying, how do I use Wi-Fi Direct? Windows 8 says it has it, but I can't find out how. Well, you can't right now. In fact, the only demonstration I could find of Wi-Fi Direct was somebody from years ago, 2011, in the early betas of Windows 8, somebody at Microsoft demonstrated it. But somewhere between then and the final release of Windows 8, it seems to have disappeared, but it still made it into the exam objective, so I wanted you to know what it was. But right now, it's vaporware. This is Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and I hope you found the lesson both educational and enjoyable, and I'll see you next time.